Dan got tricks in the tank, taking a bet, stealing a groundhog. If there's trouble, they ain't gonna back off. Jeb and Dan fishing again.
It was a peaceful Sunday morning at Possumhall Pond. The kind of morning where even the bullfrogs were still half asleep, and the mist hung low over the water like a lazy ghost. Jeb and Dan, two old geezers with more stubbornness than sense, floated in their rubber rafts, sipping coffee and waiting for the catfish to bite. Now this, Jeb sighed, stretching his legs, is the life. Just you, me, and the... That's when Dan's fishing pole nearly snapped in half. "Whoa, Jeb, I got me a monster," Dan hollered, gripping his rod like his life depended on it. Before Jeb could react, Dan's raft jerked forward so hard it nearly left a wake. The unseen beast beneath the water was pulling him at full throttle across the pond, his old straw hat flying off his head. "Cut the line, Dan," Jeb yelled, trying to paddle out of the way. "Cut the line?" Dan shot back. "This thing's bigger than my truck." Jeb barely had time to react before Dan's runaway raft slammed into his, sending both of them spinning like tangled windsocks. Fishing rods clattered, coffee splashed, and both men hollered like kids on a busted carnival ride. Then came the sound of psst, that terrible, unmistakable noise. Dan looked down in horror. "Jeb, my raft's got a hole in it." One of the catfish's razor-sharp fins had punctured the rubber, and air was hissing out faster than a possum in a dogfight. The raft sagged like a waterlogged biscuit, and Dan started sinking with it. "Grab my paddle," Jeff hollered, reaching out. But Dan wasn't about to give up. His arms were wrapped around the fishing pole like it was a winning lottery ticket. "I ain't letting go, Jeb. This sucker's a world record." Just then, the monstrous catfish surfaced, and it was enormous. The thing was at least 5 feet long, with whiskers like ropes, eyes that glowed like swamp lanterns, and a mouth big enough to swallow a football. It was a Wels Catfish. Huge, top, mid-depth, epic fish. Used worm, popper, or minnow, looking for the biggest swirl with a large swirl pattern. It thrashed, spraying water everywhere, and let out a deep, guttural goop as if mocking them. Dan's raft, now nearly flat, dipped below the water. He was treading water, still gripping the rod, when the fish made one final, violent pull. Whoosh! Dan disappeared underwater. "Dan?" Jeb yelled, eyes wide. For a moment, nothing, just ripples. Then BAM! Dan exploded out of the water, riding the catfish like a bucking bronco. "Yee-haw!" Dan whooped, water flying from his soaked overalls. The catfish thrashed wildly, trying to shake him off, but Dan had both hands locked onto its whiskers like reins. Jeb just stared, slack-jawed. "What in the..." The fish zigzagged across the pond, dragging Dan with it. He held on for dear life, bouncing off the water like a rodeo cowboy. "Dan, let go!" Jeb hollered. "No way," Dan shouted back. "This thing's taking me to the other side." And sure enough, the fish wasn't stopping. He was headed straight for the far end of the pond, where the old beaver dam sat. Jeb started paddling furiously, but he was too late. Kersplash! Dan and the catfish barreled straight through the dam, sending sticks, mud, and one very surprised beaver flying in all directions. Then, silence. Jeb floated there, stunned, gripping his paddle. Seconds later, a soaking wet Dan stumbled out of the wreckage, coughing up water and holding the catfish. Only now, instead of fighting, the fish was just laying there, looking equally traumatized. Jeb paddled over, shaking his head. "Dan, you okay?" Dan, dripping and covered in beaver debris, grinned. "Jeb, I just rode a catfish." Jeb squinted at him. "You sure did." Dan looked down at the fish, then back at Jeb. "You think this thing counts as the biggest catch in Possumhall history?" Jeb studied the massive fish, then the ruined beaver dam, then his soaking wet best friend. "Well, I reckon we'll need a heck of a story to explain it." Dan grinned. "Good thing we've got one." And with that, Jeb tossed him a rope, pulling him back onto the raft. and they paddled home. 2 old geezers, 1 monster catfish, and a fishing tale no one would ever believe. Jeb and Dan on the way home stopped in at Charred Tail's barbecue joint, a hole in the wall known for its legendary smoked meats and dangerously spicy sauces. Dan, always the adventurous type, decided to smother his ribs in the infamous Ooh Mama flame sauce. As they left the restaurant, Dan sniffled. His sinuses blasted wide open like a floodgate. Walking down the sidewalk toward the car, he suddenly felt the need for good old-fashioned Hillbilly Hanky. He covered one nostril, leaned over the grass, and let it rip. A forceful, let her fly, boys, that would make any country boy proud. Unfortunately, when he straightened up, he realized his fatal mistake. Right in front of him stood the restaurant's massive glass window, and behind it, dozens of diners staring in horror. The chain reaction started instantly. A man near the window gagged. A woman dropped her fork. A kid pointed with a mix of fascination and terror. Then it happened. Someone inside let loose with a full-force projectile upchuck, triggering a sickening domino effect of disgust. Dan, wiping his nose, cleared his throat and turned to Jeb. "We better leave. Quick." So how about that story? Left me a little queasy there at the end. But good story nonetheless. Thanks, Al. So there are 5 places that you can catch the Wels Catfish. One is Belgium, the Belgium DLC, map number 2. The other is Netherlands DLC, map number 3. And then the last 3 maps are in the Europe 2 DLC, map 1, map 2, and map 3. This is Europe 2 DLC map 3, which is Castle Anholt. And so here we are. We're going to try and catch the Wels Catfish. So if we look at the fish index, you see that the Wels Catfish likes worm, minnow, and popper. I've always liked to catch the Wels Catfish on minnow, but quite frankly, all 3 of these work just the same. To identify it, it's really simple. The Wels Catfish is the only huge fish in all 5 maps. And so all 5 maps, it doesn't matter. Identification is the same. What you do is basically you look for a giant swirl. Since it's a mid to top fish, it's going to produce a swirl. Well, not all fish every single time produce a swirl, but we're going to skip over the times that it's there that it doesn't produce a swirl, and we're going to look for a swirl on top, and then we know it's a Wels Catfish, and because it's the only huge fish that'll produce a humongous swirl, and that's what we're going to identify it with. And as soon as we identify it, we're going to cast in. I have a minnow on the line, so we will go. So resetting the fish means just changing the difficulty and changing it back. So we change to hard, then back to expert. You'll notice that the swirls respawn. So basically all the fish in the entire map respawn when you change the difficulty. And so we utilize that to basically refresh all the fish in the map and get new fish. So we don't have anything that's producing a huge swirl right now. We also have to look in the lily pads because it could be there. But just I end up moving the screen down here so that I can see the water a little better. And I keep it open just because I wait about 5-10 seconds. And closing it a lot of times just means that I have to reopen this settings menu again to reset the fish. And I don't see a large swirl, so we're going to reset again. I usually reset about every 5 seconds or so. Maybe a little bit longer. Enough time to let the swirls spawn. See if we have a huge swirl. If not, then I just reset it. No problem with resetting it and getting new fish. You can do that as many times as you like. In fact, sometimes you have to do it quite often if you're trying to go after certain fish. Got some swirls in the lily pads this time. None of them are huge though, so we'll keep resetting. Small swirls, small swirls. Nothing big, so we reset. And like I've told people in the past, if you are wondering whether the swirl is large enough or not, it's not. Just be patient. The huge swirl will come, and you'll know that it's a huge swirl because it's pretty unmistakable. So just keep resetting. And sometimes it takes quite a few resets to actually get the fish not only to spawn, but to spawn and produce a swirl. I thought there was going to be one there. So it kind of starts small sometimes and kind of gets giant as you go. But none of those panned out. Got a small swirl in the lily pads, but definitely not big enough. There we go. There's our Wels Catfish right here. Giant swirl, much bigger than other swirls. And it turns our line red within 3 seconds of being in, near it. It will pull drag. And we'll also see it jump. So you'll be able to confirm that it is a Wels Catfish. It does pull some left and right. It's not a really hard fish to catch. It's a fun fish to catch. In fact, I would say that it fights just enough to make it fun. Just enough to make it fun, but not overly challenging. And yeah, I really enjoy catching this fish. So. And who knows, if I were in a boat, it probably would be pulling me. It probably would pull me along. Oh, it snapped off. That's what I get for setting it too hard. Should be in the same spot, but that swirl is over there. But it is in the same spot. That's the swirl. It just kind of went back to a different spot. Come on, Wels Catfish. I know you like this bait. There we go. And I'm not going to pull it so hard this time. Like I said, it is a little bit of a challenge to catch. Enough to be a fun challenge, so if you reel too hard, it will break off. It's not going to let you like power reel it or anything like that. I missed the snap there. Now it does like turn around while it's jumping, or it can. Sometimes it comes straight up and straight down, which that's when it confuses me on the snap. I just went completely the wrong way on the snap. But we're here. Missing a snap is not the end of the world. It's here and we've caught it. 86 inches. Let's see. 86 inches, which is probably average. I think average that we were seeing was about 82 to 83. So this is really in the average range. The records are like 102.3, I believe. 102.3 something. So yeah. But yeah, great. It's a great fish. 86 inches. Enjoy. And hopefully Jeb and Dan have more fun catching these and they don't pop their boat next time. Anyway, tight lines, everyone.